Now, there's a popular new program that's been out on Netflix for a few weeks. I don't know if you've heard this about it or not. Called Meghan and Harry. Anybody heard of that program? It's about the prince and his wife Meghan. From England, and the part of the royal family, and the dispute, and all the things that have happened, and all the drama that's been a part of all of that. And it's really been interesting to watch. My family, Becky and I, we've been watching or have watched both seasons of The Crown. I think it's just 2 seasons. Maybe there's more than 1 season. I don't know. I can't keep up with it all, but we've been watching it. And, you know, I love historical pieces and things that talk about the different moments in history that, and then you kind of see what might have been behind the scenes. And then this new documentary by Meghan and Harry, kind of like history is happening as we are just kind of like, we're watching it unfold right before our very eyes. But one of the images that stuck out to me was because in this documentary, while Harry is talking about his life growing up in the royal family and all that kind of stuff, there's these pictures and these videos of when he was born. And there's this guy who would come out onto the corner of the street. This is in London, and when one of the princes is born, he would come out and he would announce to everybody. I don't know if he rang a bell or not. I can't remember right off the top of my head here. But he would announce to everybody that was standing there on the street that the birth of this new prince and how much he weighed and all this stuff. And everybody would be waiting to hear the great news that this town crier would come out and say. And he was actually dressed in like the red coats and, you know, that the white wig and all that kind of stuff. So it's like really interesting to watch and think about how that had happened over the years when kings or queens, when they would have new family members born, you know, and they would tell this story and everybody would want to hear about it, right? And it starts off like it starts off as like a small group of people who would hear about it, and then it would spread as people would hear and tell each other and tell about the birth of the new members of the royal family. It's interesting to think about how an announcement was made that had such a huge national event tied to it. In fact, whether it was Harry or his brother William when he was born, right, telling about the possibility of a future king, huge implications. Well, over the last several weeks, we've been talking about these spiritual messengers of Christmas, the angels of Christmas, if you will, right? These agents of God who would show up in stories throughout the Bible. They sometimes are carrying messages of warning or messages of hope, but almost always their messages are about the change that is coming. And for the Advent series that we've been going through, these weeks leading up to Christmas, we particularly looked at these angels who were telling the announcements that God is fulfilling his promise to God's people, that God is going to enter into the human experience, that God is going to rescue the people once again. That a new king who will save the people and save them from something even bigger than just their oppressors. That God was going to save the people from the oppression of their hearts and their souls. And after the angel tells Zechariah in the first story of an angel showing up on the scene that his wife Elizabeth was going to have a son, was going to have a baby even in their older age, and that their son, who by the name would be eventually known as John the Baptist, will be in the same way as the prophets of the Old Testament, right? Hundreds of years before this. So they would actually give birth to a son who would tell people to get ready for the coming Messiah, the coming King of Israel. And then the next angel story is when the angel appears to Mary and tells her that she will actually carry this next king, right? She will carry the Son of God, and that God would send the Holy Spirit to her in such a way that she would become pregnant. And the reason that it happens like that is so that there would be no doubt that this baby is both fully human and fully divine. And then, after this happens, by the way, Mary, who is in the middle of an engagement with a guy named Joseph, well, she has to tell him what's about to happen. And Joseph, who is this man whose family tree is from King David, right? The last great king of Israel. The king that God had promised that one day the Messiah would actually come through his family tree. And then in this dream, Joseph is reminded that he is a son of David. He is a part of the family tree of King David. And the angel tells Joseph, you can believe Mary, that the baby she will give birth to will save people from their sins. And Joseph, the angel tells him, you will name him Jesus, which means God saves. So all this happens, and then probably around 6 months goes by that they don't hear from another angel. There's not another angel experience that happens. At least there aren't any recorded angel experiences. There aren't any new great proclamations that happens. And Mary and Joseph, they have to make their way to Bethlehem because there's this census that has to be taken, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But when they arrive in Bethlehem, somehow they end up in a space that was set aside for animals. Now, whether that was a section of someone's home, maybe a relative's home, it could have been downstairs where the family animals may have been kept. It could have been that all the people slept upstairs and they had to stay downstairs. Those details aren't as important as the fact that the space that the baby was born in and what it represents, that's what's important. We'll talk about that in a moment too. But the next angel experience or encounter that happens is with a bunch of shepherds, right? Watching over their sheep at night. And this is how this goes down. And we're going to look, going back to the book of Luke in the New Testament. This is Luke chapter 2. Listen to how this next angel experience goes down. That night, there were shepherds staying in fields nearby, guarding their flocks of sheep. Suddenly, an angel of the Lord appeared among them, and the radiance of the Lord's glory surrounded them. And they were terrified. But the angel reassured them. Now, could you all say this with me? I know it's early, but I want you to give me the best don't be afraid I can imagine, right? Here we go. Ready? Don't be afraid. Oh, goodness, you guys sound really good. You want to be in a program here in just a minute? I mean, he said, listen to what he says. I bring you good news that will bring great joy to all people. All people. The Savior, yes, the Messiah, the Lord, has been born today in Bethlehem, the city of David. And you will recognize him by this sign. You will find a baby wrapped snugly in strips of cloth, lying in a manger. Suddenly, the angel was joined by a vast host of others, the armies of heaven, praising God and saying, "Glory to God in highest heaven, and peace on earth to those with whom God is pleased. When the angels had returned to heaven, the shepherds said to each other, let's go to Bethlehem. Let's see this thing that has happened, which the Lord has told us about. They hurried to the village and found Mary and Joseph, and there was the baby lying in a manger. I thought this was interesting. This version says they were staying in the fields nearby, but other versions say what a really good interpretation of this particular text says they were actually more like living in the fields. Like they were living out in the fields. Here are these shepherds whose lives are spent in the fields, right? Everything they are, their identity, their purpose for existence is in the fields. And the more I studied this and researched a little bit of the background here, see, shepherds could be known for being a little bit rough around the edges, right? They could be known for being for moving into lands that weren't their own land that they owned, right? And taking it up and spending time there with their sheep who are eating the grass and everything there. They probably didn't smell the greatest, right? Spending all day and all night out in the fields, you just don't. And there they are, protecting the sheep, making sure they didn't wander off, making sure that they didn't get eaten or stolen. The sheep were their livelihood. And yes, while they may have been a little rough around the edges, maybe they were like, I'd rather be hanging out with the sheep than other people, right? You ever met somebody like that? What we do know is this, though, that their quiet night gets interrupted. It says that the angel of the Lord appeared among them and makes this big announcement. And it's interesting how Luke, the guy who's writing this, is telling this story about the birth of Jesus. He opens this whole chapter up by talking about how this census is taken. And he likes to add dates. Luke is known as like this historian who likes to add dates to kind of give us an idea of a timeline where things are happening, kind of a time frame, to try to help us understand how real this was and how much validity there is to it. And in Luke 2, he writes about a census that has taken place. And for all accounts, historians can't really find a historical point where this census had been taken right at that moment, right? But it was taken a little later in Israel's history. Quirinius was a governor just a little bit later after this. But what this could have meant, well, a couple of things that it could have meant. Number one, they could have been getting ready for the census, right? But also, Luke makes this so that we can kind of get an understanding of what's going on in the world around them. See, it is a statement of what the birth of Jesus would be up against. And we don't see it very often when we think of the Christmas story. But from the start of this birth, it represents that there is a tension. There's a tension on the grander scale of the world. See, by mentioning the emperor of Rome, not only is Luke trying to convey the timing of this birth, but it reveals what people would have known about, right? Zechariah would have known this, Elizabeth would have known this, Mary and Joseph would have known this, the shepherds would have known this. They know what it means to be occupied by the Roman Empire. They know about the Roman emperor and who he is and what he represents. In fact, one writer, I was reading about this. This is what he says. He says, Luke has introduced the story by telling us about Augustus Caesar, way off in Rome, at the height of his power. See, Augustus was the adopted son of Julius Caesar. He became the sole ruler of the Roman world after a bloody civil war in which he overpowered all other rivals. See, Augustus turned the great Roman Republic into an empire with himself at the head. He proclaimed that he had brought justice and peace to the world and declaring his dead adopted father to be divine. Styled himself, this is Augustus, as the Son of God. Poets at the time wrote songs about the new era that had begun. Historians told the long story of Rome's rise to greatness, reaching the climax, obviously, with Augustus himself, right? Augustus, people said, was the savior of the world. He was its king, its lord, right? Increasingly, in the eastern part of his empire, people worshiped him too as a god. Isn't that interesting? It's no accident that Jesus arrives on the scene like he does. It's no accident that God would send an angel to say what he says. God is making a statement that is on purpose and puts all the kings and all the emperors and all the presidents and all the dictators of all time and people who have any kind of power. God is putting them on notice with the birth of this baby. And it's also no accident that the first people who hear about the birth of the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords are not some power players far off in a palace. They were a bunch of rough around the edges shepherds living on the hillside. The last people on earth probably that anyone would have expected to be the first people to know. But again, this is no accident. The imagery is on purpose. And the angels say to these shepherds, what the angels say to these shepherds is critical to what Jesus means to the world for all time. He says, the angel does in verse 10, I bring you good news that will bring great joy to all people. Caesar Augustus couldn't say that. See, after the shepherds got past all of the afraid stuff that they had going on, the first thing he says is, I bring you good news, and that good news will bring great joy to all people. This opening line of the announcement cannot be understated of how important it is. When I think about the message of Christianity, especially maybe over these last 20 or 30 years, I'm not so sure that people connect what the church is saying with good news sometimes. So what is good news, right? And how does it, not only how will it, how does it bring great joy to all people? Listen, the good news is that God is here to rescue people from the enemy of their souls. God has followed through on God's promise. God has been born, one of us, to show us that we can be free to live a life filled with God's purpose and love. That the torment of identity chasing, that the fear of death, that the selfish mentality that eats us up from the inside out, that the disease of sin that entered into the DNA of our existence when humanity turned its back on God, the good news is it can be healed. That is the good news. It's still possible. The good news these shepherds hear is this baby that is born will one day step into his calling to show us how we can be healed and then give us what we need to actually do it. That is the good news. And it is a good news for all people. Even here it is. Even if you don't accept it, even if you reject Jesus, even if you reject God's love, God will never stop loving you. And the only way we know that to be true is because of Jesus. I love it when somebody comes to me and they want to tell me about how they rededicated their life to Jesus. And we talk about how God never gave up on them. See, what happened that night with the shepherds on that hillside and what the angels are telling the shepherds is exactly that. Guess what? God never gave up on you. That's what this birth, this baby represents. The King of the world was born, and it was good news. He would grow up and show the world how to love, what real love actually looks like. He would grow up. He would care for the poor. He would grow up and feed the hungry. Let me tell you something. Jesus saw those who felt invisible. Jesus talked to those who felt alone. Jesus stood up for those who could not stand up for themselves. This is one of the reasons the shepherds hear about it first. Not only is it to be connected that Jesus is from the family line of the shepherd king, another description of King David. Not only that, not only will he be the one that is called the great shepherd who protects the faith of his followers. Not only will he be known as the shepherd who goes looking for the one who has wandered away. But Jesus came to actually show us what good news means when it is driven by God's love. Because hear this. What good is good news if it doesn't do any good? What good is good news if it doesn't do any good? When Jesus even begins his ministry, when Jesus is 30 years old and he is baptized by John the Baptist, the one who has come before him. When Jesus goes into the desert and is tempted by the devil himself and who tries to get him off track, who tries to convince him that he doesn't really know who he is, Jesus comes back to the good news. If you were to go a few chapters into Luke 4, these are the words of Jesus. This is why this baby was born. He says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, for he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim that captives will be released, that the blind will see, that the oppressed will be set free, and that the time of the Lord's favor has come." This is what was beginning that night. This is what was set in motion that first Christmas night. And these shepherds are invited to come and see. And the angel tells them that there's going to be a sign. This is how you will know that this is who we are talking about. The sign is incredibly meaningful too, right? The fact that he's born where he is born in the stable-like setting where there's a manger, where he's wrapped up in strips of cloth. No royalty would ever be born like that. This baby, this future king, God in the form of a human, is born in a manger and placed in a place for animals to be fed. Not a palace, not even a middle-class home. Not a Roman citizen protected by Roman Empire power. In reality, he's like an outsider to all things powerful as we humans would think. So the shepherds, they decide they need to go and check this out. I was thinking about this though. There's no record of a big angel choir that visibly shows up with Mary and Joseph when the baby is born. I don't read anything about that. There are no stories recorded of how an angel guided Mary and Joseph on their journey. And once Mary left Elizabeth's house, her relative, after she had her baby, I kind of got to thinking about, man, can you imagine how alone that couple must have felt? Can you imagine how difficult a journey it would have been for Mary, who was 9 months pregnant, and the way that it was back then, there were no great roads for them to follow. There were trails uphill and around rocks and all kinds of other things. There were threats to them. The anxiety of carrying a baby. There's no record of a donkey. I know somehow we have added a bunch of stuff to the story over the years, and maybe they had a donkey, maybe they didn't. Either way, it was hard. And they make it to Bethlehem. They have the baby. Maybe they had a midwife who was there to help them in the process. Maybe not. The chances are pretty high that they were alone. And I was thinking, here they are. They have this baby. And somebody comes knocking on the door. Mary, Joseph, there are some people outside. Some shepherds who say they are here to see your baby. What do you want us to do with them? When we had Lily, our daughter, we had been living in Salem, Illinois for 9 months, right? Like, we were literally living there the entire time, and Becky was pregnant with her. And we had actually, in the midst of all of that, felt a call to move again to another church and to take another position. And so we were in the midst of a transition while Becky went into labor, and we're at the hospital. And so we felt very alone, right? Like, nobody had done anything. Nobody had been mean to us or anything like that. It's just that feeling that you have of, like, we're in transition. We haven't been here very long. Just felt very alone. And I will never forget that first night. We were in the room there, and you're trying to read. Becky is recovering from all of this, and I am just there to help the recovery moment. And we're there, and the nurse comes to the door. She says, "Mr. and Mrs. Horton, there's a couple who are here, and this is after visiting hours are over." And they're like, "There's a couple who's here who say they know you from when you guys were in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Their last names are McKellips. What do you want us to do with them?" And we knew who they were. They had been our former pastor and our what is called the district superintendent for the Northwest Oklahoma area. And here they were in the St. Louis area, probably 4 hours away from Tulsa, Oklahoma. And they just happened to be visiting their kids in that area when they find out we had Lily. And they show up. And we're like, yes, let them in. And we were reminded that we were not alone. Friends from far off had shown up. And I think of this story of when the shepherds showed up. I wonder, not only was it a sign for the shepherds, I wonder if Mary and Joseph, in that middle of that moment, they needed to be reminded that what God had told them was really true. And here are some people to show up beside you. And they're all, I wonder if they all crowded in to see this baby born in a manger, wrapped in strips of cloth. The angels had told the shepherds. The shepherds had gone to see the sign. And here's what happens next. Luke chapter 2, verse 17. After seeing him, the shepherds told everyone what had happened and what the angel had said to them about this child. And all who heard the shepherds' stories were astonished. But Mary kept all these things in her heart and thought about them often. It says, the shepherds went back to their flocks, glorifying and praising God for all they had heard and seen. It was just as the angel had told them. The experience for these shepherds was so moving that they had to tell others about it. They had to tell others what they had experienced and what they had seen. They had to tell other people that God really was up to something in this world, that the world isn't going to hell in a handbasket after all. That's some good news right there. Here's what I believe we need to hear from this story today. 3 things when God speaks. Number 1, it is good news when God speaks. It is good news because it reminds us there is hope, there is healing. Number 2, we are reminded we are not alone. We are not alone in this faith journey. We are not alone when we trust God with our lives, when we say yes to Jesus. We're not alone. We're not alone. And number 3, we must tell others the good news. We must tell others about what we have seen and what we have experienced. We must tell others about God's love. And listen, not only tell others, we've got to show others. We've got to live it. Jesus has given us the chance to live this life, to live the good news. So will we do that? Will we do that this Christmas season? Will we embrace the good news and live it with our lives? Would you stand? Would you bow your heads and close your eyes? I want us to move into a time of reflection. Whatever this might look like for you, however you might want to respond here today, with your eyes closed, I'm going to ask you to open your heart and open your mind to what God might be saying to you. And I just want to ask you a few questions that might help prompt God speaking in your life. Number 1, what is the sign that you need in order to believe in Jesus? To believe that God sent Jesus? To believe that what Jesus can offer is healing for the deep wounds of our hearts and souls? What is the sign that you need today? What is the sign you need to know you can trust him? Right? The shepherds, it was the manger, the baby wrapped in strips of cloth. I believe the shepherds were a sign for Mary and Joseph to know they weren't alone. What is the sign that you need? Finally, for all of us, what is keeping us from telling the good news, from sharing the good news? What is keeping us from being the good news?